First step in using the quadratic formula is always to get as organized as possible. And so what we want to do is we want to move everything over to one side so that we have something equal to 0. And I always say to myself that I want to arrange it from the highest power all the way down to my number. So it should go x squared, x to the first, and then the number. So the highest power all the way down to the number. So if you look here, your x squared, x to the first, and the number, you have this order, and so that means that your a is going to be the coefficient on x, your b is going to be, or x squared, excuse me, your b is the coefficient on x, and your c is -3. So here my a will be 1, b will be -1, and c is -3. Now, once I've identified a, b, and c, then I can plug it into the quadratic formula. Now, I personally always like to write out the quadratic formula just because it is such a beautiful formula. And the other thing is I think it does kind of help us to see where everything is getting plugged in. So here's our quadratic formula. And then we talked about how this -b is going to be the opposite sign of b. So when you plug in, you're going to plug everything in with parentheses. So it's going to be negative. And then in for our b, we are going to substitute in -1. Okay. Then we'll have plus or minus square root. And for our b, we're going to substitute in -1 quantity squared. Minus 4. And for the a, we're going to substitute in +1. And in for the c, we're going to substitute in -3. Okay, and that's all under the radical, and that's over 2 times a, and a again is equal to 1. So we'll substitute in a is equal to 1. Now, at this point, we have to deal with our order of operations and simplifying. So if you go from left to right here, the negative times the negative is going to give you a +1, plus or minus the square root of, and we talked about how this negative squared, this b squared, is always going to be positive. That first number is always going to come out as a positive. So if you take 1 squared or -1 squared, you will get 1. And then the focus needs to be on this -4ac all multiplied together. Now, unfortunately, I don't have a scientific calculator, but if you work through -4 times 1 times -3. If you put that in on your scientific calculator, and again, unfortunately, I'm using a graphing calculator, but you have -4 times 1 times -3, that sign of +12, when your calculator spits out +12, all of this is being replaced with a +12. So again, I always like to kind of circle this -4ac and say, okay, all of this is going to get replaced. And in this case, it's getting replaced with the +12 that I put on my calculator, or get from my calculator. And that is divided by 2. All right, so if you look inside of the radical here, you have 1 plus 12, so that's going to give you 13 over 2. And at this point, you want to ask yourself if you can simplify any further. So what I usually do is I focus on the radical and I say, okay, can I simplify this radical any further? And 13 is a prime number, so there's no simplification that can happen there. Then I ask myself, can I simplify the fraction in some way? Now, when you simplify the fraction, one thing to notice is we kind of draw this little butterfly here because we have these two terms. So 1 divided by 2 does not reduce. And when you're reducing, you're going to be reducing the coefficient. So you're reducing the coefficient that is in front of this square root. So the coefficient of 1 divided by 2, that does not reduce. And remember, the square root of 13 is never going to be able to reduce with 2. So it's just that coefficient of 1, does it reduce with 2? And in this case, you see that nothing reduces, and so that means that we can write this as our answer as 1 plus or minus the square root of 13 over 2.